Good morning, everyone. Welcome to A Changing Landscape, the 2023-2024 California Legislative Year webinar. My name is Ling, and I'm the Membership Director with California Association of Nonprofits, CalNonprofits for short. Next, I would like to introduce Jen Masaoka, the CEO of California Association of Nonprofits, and our moderator for today. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Lynn. Welcome, everybody. I want to make sure that everybody understands the unique and interesting partnerships that puts together this series of California policy forums. And we take turns doing them. And this time CalNonprofits is the lead, but all of us work on everyone. And actually, it looks like there's three partners: Philanthropy California, the League of California Community Foundations, and CalNonprofits. But Philanthropy California is made up of three. So it's actually five partners. And Philanthropy California is Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Bernardino and Riverside counties, which is also an association of grantmakers. And it's actually unusual for grantmakers and nonprofit representatives to work together on something like this. So it's something that we're very pleased to be able to be continuing doing now in our 8th year of these California policy forums. Today, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then make just a couple of framing remarks before we go forward. And I'm going to introduce them in the reverse order that they're going to be talking, okay? So Elena Chavez Quevada is the Senior Advisor for Social Innovation at Governor Gavin Newsom's office. She is kind of a growing number of people of color who are in the administration and in the legislature who come from long and deep nonprofit backgrounds. She's on the board of Centro Legal de Raza. She comes from End Poverty in California, her own family's foundation, the Chavez Family Foundation, the San Francisco Foundation, the Haas Senior Fund, Tipping Point, and a particular focus of hers has been guaranteed income. And so we're very happy to have someone directly from the governor's office to be talking with us. Jarrett Barrios is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Community and Programmatic Initiatives at the California, it's kind of a long title, Jarrett. For the California Community Foundation based in LA. And he's previously been the CEO of the LA Red Cross, GLAD, the largest LGBT advocacy organization in the country. And he's a former member of the Massachusetts legislature. So maybe he can share some thoughts on how Massachusetts does things better or worse than California. I'm sure it's always better, right, Jarrett? Jennifer Fearing is a well-known lobbyist for many nonprofits, including us at CalNonprofits, and other clients of hers include Meals on Wheels of California, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and the National Wildlife Federation, and others. And she is frequently named as one of the top 100 most powerful people in Sacramento. She's also a dedicated volunteer for many causes. And she's going to be letting us know what to expect from the legislature, particularly as it relates to nonprofit-specific legislation. And Chris Hoene heads up the California Budget Policy Center, also located in Sacramento. He was at the National League of Cities. And if you ever read an article about the California state budget in the Sacramento Bee or the LA Times or pretty much anywhere, Chris is always quoted. So we have to believe that either they don't know anybody else, so they always have to call Chris, or he's such an expert that he's always the person that people want to go to. So just a couple of comments before we ask our first speaker, Chris, to give us his thoughts. So right now, we're in January, we're at the start of the 2023-24 legislative session. And I think the idea here is, what should we be expecting? I know one person in the chat had mentioned he's kind of scared about the state budget. And I think a lot of us have a feeling of anxiety, not just about the changing landscape that's mudslides and drought areas, but we're looking at both a continuing deep needs in the vulnerable communities and in all of California. And at the same time, we're also hearing about a big budget deficit. So I think, and the possibilities of an economic turndown. So I think those things are very good reasons for us to be concerned. And the governor has presented a budget framed around California for all. And I think for us at CalNonprofits, focusing on issues that affect a lot of nonprofits, the ambitions in the budget, the governor's ambitions and the legislature's ambitions for California, they lean very heavily on nonprofits to come up to the plate and fulfill the needs that those legislators and administrators expect us to be able to do in homelessness, disabilities, wildlife, climate mitigation, et cetera. And so I think for us at CalNonprofits, the headline news has been a statement from the governor's office saying that they acknowledge that and know that they want to work with nonprofits to change some of the government nonprofit partnerships and contracting relationships to make sure that kind of our joint partnership can fulfill what we all need California's nonprofit community to do. Okay, so let's start off with a kind of a speed briefing on the budget. I know Chris could probably talk for 2 days about it. So Chris, I want you, can you do the pundit sort of thing and give us the succinct scoop on the budget? And particularly, I guess, would ask you to say, given the needs and given the $23 billion deficit projected, is this a good budget? Should we be feeling good about this budget, or should we be feeling this is a bad budget?
Yeah, thanks, Jan, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you all again. I'd start by saying, and I will get to your question here shortly, I would start by saying don't be scared about this year's budget. There has been a lot of preparation that has gone into making sure the state is better positioned for a potential economic downturn and for budget shortfalls, and we're in a lot better position today than, say, where we were in 2007 at the start of the Great Recession. Even though there'll be some news that I'll share here shortly that may not seem like great news, I think we're looking at a pretty smart budget, to go to your question, Jan, that is actually doing the best it can with the budget shortfall and trying to do a fair bit to protect core public services and programs, while admittedly having to pull back on some investments that they had committed to in earlier years. So the big picture here is that declining economic conditions are resulting in the state's revenue sources declining, and that's what's driving a potential shortfall in the state budget. As Jan said, the governor is estimating that that's almost $23 billion in terms of what we're looking at right now. With the way that the governor's office proposes to resolve that deficit is using several tools. One of those is pulling back on one-time funding that was committed for this next fiscal year by earlier fiscal years budget. So when we enacted a budget for this year, there were some planned expenditures for 2023, 24. The governor is saying that he's going to pull back on those. I'll talk about a few of those in just a second. He's also talking about deferring some planned expenditures into later years. So instead of spending in 2023, 24, we'd spend in, say, the next fiscal year after that, or the next 1 to 3 fiscal years after that. So some of it is slowing down on some earlier commitments. And then there's a set of trigger cuts, and I'll talk about what that means shortly. But he's using a set of those mechanisms to cover the shortfall. I would say notably, he's not using the state's ample reserves, or what we casually call rainy day funds. The state has about $37 billion in reserve funds that it's built up over the last decade. And the governor is not proposing to use any of those reserves so far. That could change by May, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And then I would note a last kind of major top line here is the one that Jan already signaled, which is there is a key issue here for nonprofits, which the governor did signal very clearly in the budget that he put forward, that he intends to work with nonprofits, here's the quote, to consider changes to address issues within the nonprofit sector to support the sector's ability to deliver on meeting goals in state programs. And I think while there's not a lot of specifics there, I think that means in the near term, if the state's facing potential cuts or deferrals, it means working with the nonprofit sector still to streamline regulatory structures and systems to make it easier for nonprofits to work with the state. I think that also means in the medium term, a stronger foundation for the state working with nonprofits, so that if we get back to periods of surplus and growth, the nonprofit sector is better positioned to, with the state going forward. So it's a good sign that that's there. I want to talk about the major categories of things that are in the budget. I'm not going to go through these program by program, but I want to talk about the sort of big categories. The first is that the proposal really does try to maintain and protect investments in some core services, safety net services, education from early education up through higher ed. And so some examples of how they're trying to protect some things is that earlier years commitments to fully expanding healthcare coverage for low-income households to everyone in the state, regardless of status, is going to continue going forward. The state maintains its funding commitment. Major investments in behavioral health programs that the state's committed to continue to go forward. One-time commitments for housing and homelessness funding are protected. A variety of safety net expansions in terms of some grant increases and some streamlining of eligibility requirements also continue. Funding for cash assistance for low-income households, building out a universal TK program and expanding pre-kindergarten, that's still there. And some earlier commitments around expanding childcare slots continue. So a variety of things that are around core services that particularly help low and middle income Californians. The governor is trying to protect those. And that's very clear in the proposals, it's very clear in the messaging. I would also note that aid to nonprofits and small businesses to cover the costs of expanded paid sick leave is maintained in the budget. That commitment hasn't totally been available to small businesses and nonprofits yet. It's still being rolled out. So that piece stays there as well. I mentioned that there are ways the governor is going to cover this shortfall. So one of those is a series of what they call pulling back or withdrawn. I think most of us would just call it cuts, but maybe cuts was language they didn't want to use. But there's about $5.7 billion in cuts from prior fiscal years to this fiscal year, spending that was either planned and hadn't taken place yet or is planned for the future. Big items in this category, this is all going to sound kind of weird and wonky, but there was $3 billion in adjustments for inflation. So state programs have costs associated with them too. So we have high inflation programs, costs go up, they're taking an inflation adjustment back. That may be something that creates some funding challenges down the road, but that's one way they're resolving this. They're taking back various investments in workforce programs that were in earlier budgets. They're taking several $billion back in zero emission vehicle infrastructure expansion for automobiles and for delivery vehicles and such. And there's some other pullbacks, nearly $3 billion in reductions in transportation spending infrastructure. So they're doing a lot of kind of pulling back in the infrastructure space as a way that they're reducing earlier commitments. And those were commitments they made that were because they had surpluses in prior years. So they're saying, well, no, we don't have surplus now, so we've got to pull back on some of those expansions. There's a second category of way they're covering things here that I talked about calling deferrals, or what the governor sometimes calls funding delays. There's about $7.4 billion across several fiscal years there. Examples of what they mean by deferrals is even though they're continuing with the build out of a universal transitional kindergarten program, they've provided some facility funding to help with the augmentation or expansion of facilities. They're going to delay that from 2023-24 to the next fiscal year. The funding's still there, the funding amount stays the same, but it moves to another year. There's some similar things like that in the housing space around behavioral bridge housing and behavioral health infrastructure funding. So there's some things that are just delaying for a year or a couple of years. And then I mentioned that there are these trigger cuts. This is what they mean by the governor's budget in this, is that they're saying that there are cuts that will happen if the state's revenue picture doesn't improve. So somewhere down the road in May or June, or maybe a year from now, if the state doesn't have the revenues, there'll be some things that end up being cut. And the places that that's primarily projected to happen are in climate and transportation again, where there's $3 billion projected in potential cuts, $600 million in housing, a little over $100 million in parks, and $55 million in workforce training. So that's what the trigger cuts mean. And the governor and the administration are hopeful that they won't have to do that, but it's a contingency plan in the event that revenues don't come in. So those are the ways that they cover the shortfall. I want to come back to the issue of that they're trying to maintain a lot of core services along the way. And I think overall, when you're facing a budget shortfall, it's a pretty smart budget. It pulls back on one-time commitments that were made during periods of surplus, tries to maintain core supports for people who are most likely to be harmed by economic downturns, delays some expansions for a little bit, but still commits to them. And then I would just close by saying the big concern going forward here is that, and this is the part that sounds a little scary, but the Department of Finance and legislative leadership are all saying that they expect the budget shortfall is more likely to get worse by the time we reach May and June than it is to get better, just because of things happening in the world, economic conditions, and uncertainty. So some of these types of things that the governor is using to cover the shortfall, plus the potential for the use of reserves, there may be some other tools that come into play as they have to figure out how to cover the shortfall. And for you all, for nonprofits, for people who are in the advocacy space, I think this means that while it kind of seems like a no news or a small news budget year, it actually means there's work to do, which is we sort of simultaneously have to make asks, because if you don't make your ask, you don't have any chance of getting anything. But it also means you have to prepare for the potential for cuts or deferrals or triggers or whatever they decide to call them. So you sort of have to be ready to fight those fights on both sides. So I'll stop there. That's probably more than pundits would have said, but that's the big picture overview of the budget.
Thanks, Chris. I like the mantra kind of don't be scared by this budget. And it's good to know that pulling back and triggers are kind of euphemisms for cuts. I want to invite our panelists to ask questions of Chris also, but I have one question. If you said a lot of these things are deferring expenditures, right, or pushing them back to later years, and the situation's likely to get worse, I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean that in later years, they're just also going to get pushed back? Or I mean,
it could, right? And I think that's the thing, you know, if something that affects your work is in one of these buckets, deferrals or pullbacks or trigger cuts, I think your worry should be, well, if they're actually sort of trying to, you know, create contingency plans in the event that things go further south, that those same categories of spending could face some further reductions. Or if you're not on that list, you probably need to be pretty vigilant about what's coming next. So I don't want, you know, that part of it is a bit scary, but I do want to say, like, for those of you who remember where we were over a decade ago with the Great Recession, there were a lot of tools the state didn't have because of decisions that had been made previously. There were a lot of options the state has for ways to solve shortfalls. And there was a lot more tools in the toolbox this time around. So, you know, fingers crossed. I don't think we're expecting that it's going to be quite so painful like it was a decade ago.
Okay, we have two quick questions, Chris, for participants. One is, you know, which programs in housing are most likely to get affected by a trigger cut? And, you know, a lot of CalFresh food stamp recipients maybe are facing cuts in March. Yeah. What are your thoughts about those two ones in particular? And Jennifer, you've got a question too. Why don't you ask it right now and you can answer them all at once?
Yes, Chris, yesterday a number of progressive legislators rolled out a new wealth tax proposal, and I was curious, obviously the first thing some of us think about when we're short on money is how to get more. So curious what you think the prospects for that initiative this year might be.
Sure, thanks. So I'll take them in order. On the $600 million in trigger cuts in housing, I don't have the list right in front of me, but there is an outline of that in the governor's budget summary. And I'm happy to share that link with you all so that you can see but I don't have those committed to memory at this point. On the CalFresh or food assistance program, yes, that's an excellent question. There was emergency expansion of the federal food assistance benefits that was a response to the pandemic. And those food assistance benefits are actually set to expire in the end of February, which means the folks who receive them will receive their last benefits in March. And the federal government is not going to further expand those because Congress can't get that sort of thing done these days. And the governor's budget does not include any additional funding to try to help backfill that loss. And so it's about $500 million that won't be coming into California for the households that receive those additional benefits. It's about $80 a month on average. If you're very low income, it can be as much as $200 a month in food assistance. So it's pretty significant loss. And I know advocates are gearing up to really make a strong push that the governor needs to at least put some one-time dollars into continuing that temporary expansion. And so we'll see how that progresses, you know, sort of through May. On the wealth tax issue, yes, I did see the headline about that. There has been legislation introduced the last several years to institute a wealth tax, which is a tax on people's net worth. So it's trying to get, right now, our personal income tax largely goes to that wage and salary income, or the type of income you get from, say, capital gains on stocks. But we don't tax net worth like people's properties overseas, art collections, various sorts of other ways that high wealth folks tabulate their wealth. And so the idea here is that we would tax wealth, and there's a lot of wealth in California, and generate some additional revenue. There are a lot of concerns about the potential for that to result in some sort of flight out of the state, as there always are with tax issues. And there are concerns that it creates some sort of interstate competition issues. And so one of the things that headline today talked about was that there were 7 states, all largely states with high wealth, or larger numbers of high wealth individuals, that are actually talking about all trying to do this to sort of stop some of the interstate competition among those high wealth states. I think it's a concept right now, how it may be pretty far from implementation, but there have been gradually more moves toward this idea of a wealth tax. Last thing I'd just say on the tax front is it's not the only tool in the toolbox on the revenue side either. The state actually gives away $70 billion a year in tax breaks that largely go to high wealth individuals and corporations. And all of those things never have sunset dates. They hardly ever get reviewed. When folks like the Legislative Analyst's Office do research on their effects, they usually find that they're not that effective, or they're not going to the people who are intended. So there is an opportunity to actually roll back some of these kind of loophole issues and raise some additional revenues if the state could muster up if state leaders could muster up the political will to do that.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, that's the big question, right? If the state can muster up the political will, and that's the first introduction for Jennifer Fearing at Fearless Advocacy. And so Jennifer, there are a lot of new legislators this year. What should we be thinking about these new legislators and how they feel about nonprofit causes? And what should nonprofits be doing given how many new legislators there are?
Well, thanks, Jan. Yes, there is a lot to say about personnel changes in Sacramento this year. And so I'm glad to be here and engaging with nonprofit advocates. Thanks for having me. So you asked on the state legislature, that's where the real personnel change has taken place. And it's due to a combination of factors. The every 10-year redistricting process that's prompted by the census has changed the maps for all manner of elected officials. And that prompted a number of members to vacate their seats rather than compete with their colleagues. There were term limits. The last batch of term limits that were modified by the voters several years ago prompted a number of legislators to exit after their 12 years were up. There were also a few that I think the Great Resignation effects that affected everyone in the workforce. A few folks who didn't have to leave, but decided that they were done with their term in office. So huge turnover with a lot of incumbents retiring and 31 new legislators. So a quarter of the legislature are new. For those of us that like change, like me, this is exciting. And for those of us that like diversity, it's really exciting because the diversity quotient in the Capitol doesn't yet reflect California's population as a whole, but we certainly made strides in the right direction. Women now make up 51 of the 120 seats. We have an all-time high of Latino legislators at 35 and a record 9 LGBTQ plus identified state lawmakers. We have our first Muslim and Sikh members of the legislature. And so there's a really great tool that's being dropped in the chat. Cal Matters created this neat interactive tool, and how much does the legislature look like California and how much you, given your own demographics, are reflected in California. So I urge you to check that out and be conversant in it. Within the new class of lawmakers, 17 of them are women compared to 14 men. This is the largest ever number of women in a class. That's exciting. And the class includes 22 native Californians, so folks born in California, 6 born in other states, and 3 born outside the United States. Fun fact, 2 from Mexico and 1 born in Vietnam. There is also a new member guide that was compiled by one of my colleagues at another advocacy firm that has really great bios and contact information for all of these new members of the legislature. So what do we do when we're faced with a whole bunch of new decision makers as we build new relationships? Most of these new class of legislators are going to serve for 12 years. The way term limits work, you could serve 6 2-year assembly terms, 3 4-year Senate terms, or some combination. So it's really going to be imperative for advocates that don't already have relationships with these folks, and many of you might because a lot of these folks didn't just appear out of thin air. They were elected officials, or in some cases, nonprofit leaders in their community that put their hat in the ring and were successful in pursuing state office. So district level engagement within the community and building long-term connections as they sort out what legacy, what policy priorities they're going to pursue here. Now is the time to be engaging them. Some other personnel matters that are relevant for all of us doing advocacy in Sacramento. The Assembly Democratic Caucus voted unanimously in early December that Speaker Anthony Rendon will retain the speakership through July 1st, which enables him to preside over one final state budget negotiation. And they also voted unanimously that Assembly member Robert Rivas from the Salinas area will become the speaker come July 1st. And in the Senate, Pro Tem Toni Atkins is in her final 2 years in office. So we can now start, now that the Assembly has been sort of settled, we can now start to watch the jockeying take place in the Senate and fully expect Senator Atkins to weigh in heavily as to who succeeds her. So we'll keep our eyes there. On the partisanship front, the Democratic caucuses in the legislature are at an all-time high, and the 8 Republicans in the Senate are the lowest number of Republicans since 1883, while the 18 Republicans in the Assembly are the fewest in that House since 1876. I also just discovered a really cool new tool that the California Research Bureau put out that's a district with the new districts that allows you to map with great comparisons of different demographic and economic information across Assembly and Senate districts. So encourage you to check that out. In the executive branch, which Elena is part of, Governor Newsom was obviously reelected for a second and final term as governor. And my own take is that while his tenure so far has focused on responding to crises like the global pandemic and the historic climate-induced wildfires, droughts, and now floods, he is likely to want to focus in his final 4 years on implementing his priorities and his vision that he was able to invest with a record budget surpluses that Chris's story, characterization notwithstanding, are still significant and a lot of new programs that are trying to get up and off the ground that reflect a lot of the governor's priorities and vision for California. So he's constraining a little bit of that vision, but I anticipate he's going to focus a lot on trying to make those programs work. California saw a lot less turnover of state executive officers than we've seen in quite a while. In fact, with only one constitutional officer departing, and that's State Controller Betty Yee, Californians elected only one new constitutional officer this year, and that was BOE member Sally Lieber, who some of you remember from her days in the legislature. This is fun fact, the lowest turnover in the state's executive branch since 1962. We do have a new controller, and that's former BOE member Malia Cohen. So again, less work to do on building new relationships at the executive branch, but a lot of work to do in the legislature. In terms of nonprofit kind of sector-wide policy advocacy, which is what we in CalNonprofits focus on, Chris mentioned by the governor in his budget summary of where he made a commitment to work with the nonprofit sector to improve our partnership and relationships. That was due to 550 or more philanthropic and nonprofit and community leaders who worked with CalNonprofits to elevate very detailed set of much needed and much overdue, but now urgent reforms that we need to the way that we structure and function in our relationships as contractors, primarily for services and projects with the state of California. The record budget surplus meant turning to nonprofits in a significant way because one-time money is challenging to stand up new state programs. And so you just bring inflation and the broad inequity in our society and just this demand for services for vulnerable Californians. And when you pair that with challenges of contracting practices that don't reimburse for full costs, that don't have any advance or startup payments, that often don't pay on time, that have a lot of burdensome kind of application and reporting issues that fundamentally rolls up to an equity issue. We have so many organizations that are simply not in a capitalized position to partner with the state, and we need them to be able to be active in their communities as full-fledged partners. So we are tickled at the governor's commitment in his budget, and he's identified a leader within the government gov ops department agency that we feel very confident in stewarding a conversation, and be on the lookout for a package of bills, because the legislature wants to have our back too. And we will be introducing a whole series of bills meant to implement these, to help us engage with the administration in a meaningful way. Chris mentioned the supplemental sick leave relief. I'll put an asterisk on that because of the total amount of money that was available for that, it's only nonprofits and small businesses with 26 to 49 employees who will ultimately be eligible for some reimbursement for that extra supplemental sick leave that was legislated in California last year. So we'll be at the table trying to make sure that's implemented in an equitable way. And again, that accessing those resources are as easy as possible for those who are eligible. We're gearing up for the reestablishment of the 2 nonprofit select committees, one in the Assembly and one in the Senate, and hope that they produce some good informational hearings. We really have those 2 committees to thank for kicking off this contracting reform effort with a really valuable hearing that was held last February. So we look forward to them helping us keep driving conversation of urgent matters for the nonprofit sector this year too. So, and then lastly, California Nonprofits Day will be is it our 8th year this year, Jan? I think it's our 8th or 9th year, but June 7th, 2023 will be the California Nonprofits Day. We will celebrate nonprofits who are chosen by their elected officials with a luncheon here on the Capitol grounds on that day. And so another good reason to engage your legislator would be to ask them to consider recognizing you as their nonprofit of the year. And then lastly, I'll just close by mentioning that we will provide links to the calendar, the legislative calendar, and to the LegInfo site so you can track bills that would be of interest to your organization. Deadlines are coming, and we want to make sure everyone's able to follow along and engage when relevant. And it was stated a little bit earlier, but I want to put a really fine point on it. Just the past couple of years, nonprofit advocates are responsible for successfully articulating and advocating for state support to address food insecurity, housing and homelessness, senior nutrition, a personal favorite of mine, beaver restoration, plastic pollution reduction, arts education funding, climate change policies, including assistance for victims of water insecurity and extreme heat. We are living through an all hands on deck moment with the combination of a rapidly warming planet, a global pandemic, economic inequality, and inflation, and advocacy is a necessity. Nonprofits have to be here and fully engaged. So for funders on the call, someone asked it in the chat, if funding, lobbying, and advocacy hasn't been something you've traditionally been comfortable with, I beseech you to please consider it. There are so many excellent and necessary ideas for urgent change that are coming from communities and nonprofits. And if you're nervous about this at all, I would recommend seeking the guidance of Boulder Advocacy, and we can connect you with them. But it's an urgent need, and nonprofits need all the encouragement and support to engage that they can. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Jennifer. Wow, you covered so much ground so fast, Jarrett. I think you should try to see if you can speak even faster than Jennifer. Okay, so ramp up the competition here. But I think she was looking at you, Jarrett, when she was making that point about speaking to funders in particular, as well as to all of our funding partners on the call. And so, I think particularly, right, one of the things that must be on the minds of the foundation community and high net worth donors, for example, is what they're looking at with the potential fall in stock prices, right, and what that means for their portfolios. But in general, I think, what are you hearing major givers and foundations say about the budget or about the outlook for nonprofits and the work that we do? Jarrett, you're on mute.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me now? Thank you, Jan. And I was so excited to hear Chris and Jennifer's presentations. I was just a little worried, Jennifer. I thought you said beaver restoration. Did Justin move out of state? But then I checked. It was on a beaver restoration. No, I went online real quick and checked. And Jennifer, you'll be happy to know, and I guess, Jan, this is how I'll start my comments, to introduce the California Community Foundation. We are one foundation among many. There are many community foundations, many foundations in California. We're one of the larger ones. We are LA's community foundation. And like a few of our sister foundations or brother foundations, we are deeply engaged in advocacy. We work with Boulder Advocacy quite a lot. We train all of our grant makers, and we fund advocacy as part of our portfolio. So, and that's probably why I'm here today, because it's through that lens that I think about, to Jan's question, you know, how do we look at the budget? Foundations that tend to focus on advocacy tend to do it with an eye towards systems change. And I say that I don't want to speak for everybody, but that is, you have a set of a set of systems change priorities that are in part connected to what's going on in the legislature and what's going on in the executive branch. And the budget is usually where those two issues overlap. And so, Jen, if it's okay, I'll talk about some of the things we're keeping our eyes on, which I suspect are things other foundations are keeping their eyes on and are interested in with the budget. But again, these are CCF and our priorities here in LA. Chris, you mentioned some stuff around housing. We were very excited to see kind of the level funding for the most part of a lot of the homeless programs. But I think we maintain our view, at least in LA, with homelessness probably is the #1 issue on the minds of our voters and our communities and our leaders. That solutions that level funding is fine. We weren't expecting a lot more from California, and that we've got to find solutions locally. We passed recently, with the end of a major funding initiative locally, HHH, which comes to an end in a couple years. We passed at the ballot box a big initiative here in LA called United House LA. And that's really where we're looking for systems change solutions on homelessness, but we obviously need the backstop of state funding. On the health route, I think everybody, Chris, you mentioned the healthcare for all, the Medi-Cal that's going to be covering now 26 to 49-year-olds, which will complete the package so that our undocumented residents will have system. That is something we've been working on for about 10 years. We're delighted the governor maintains it. Worried that it, survive in the legislature. We don't know what the budget's going to look like come May, right? And because this is something that's still quote unquote new, we're obviously worried about that. We're also keeping our eyes on the redetermination process coming out of COVID. That's less of a budget issue, but will have budget implications. Something else we're keeping our eyes on. In education, we are delighted with the transitional kindergarten, that maintaining it the next year, the next crop out to April now, which will be great for 4-year-olds in California. Not happy that we haven't been able to have a breakthrough yet on the rates issue in early care. That's not something we're expecting. You got to work with labor, you got to work with a lot of groups. But that's still something that's out there, Jan, that a lot of our nonprofits who work in the early care and education space have been bringing to the fore. I will mention one other one, which is sort of perhaps counterintuitive. Chris, I don't know if you mentioned this, but one of the things you all wrote about in your summary was looking at within the broadband equity space, some of the delays that the governor has proposed for the capital investments, both in in the middle and the last mile infrastructure investments. I believe it were a couple of the funds were delayed. One of those, the last mile infrastructure grants, which was what we think of as the big dollars to localities are. And then there's the loan loss reserve fund, which frees up localities to do more work. We're actually not unhappy about those delays. The reason being, the CPUC recently put out maps prioritizing communities based on equity principles that, in our view, and in the view of many other foundations who follow this, are not particularly equitable. To give you an example, the communities deemed most in need in Los Angeles County, I don't know if you know any of these high need communities, Calabasas, where the Kardashians live, Malibu, and Palos Verdes, where Mr. Trump has a golf course. We don't believe these are high need communities. We are actually debating. We've got our legislature, Jen, you'll be happy to know we're testifying next week. The legislature's engaged with the CPUC to review these. And so the actual delay in funding, Chris, we see as helpful, while the CPUC goes back to school on what equity looks like. And hopefully we'll get that fixed so that some of our higher need communities will actually benefit from those dollars. So those are some of the systems change issues that work on, Jan, and we do that obviously in partnership with our nonprofits that we fund.
That's really helpful, Jarrett. We have a couple of questions, I think, from our participants here that I think are important ones. One is, what are you hearing foundations say about how they're repositioning their funding, given the anticipation of a deficit, for example, and maybe cuts to social net services, and also, how can foundations best partner with the state of California to make sure that nonprofits can do the best work that we do, given this?
Absolutely. Well, the second question is easy because Elena's right here on the call, and I'm going to say, Elena, we're going to partner with you, and that's really her role. I would also note that if you live in a part of California where your county and city government doesn't have a counterpart to what Elena does with the governor, you might actually work with your local or county government to establish that. We in LA are blessed to have a woman named Kate Anderson, and she works at the county. And so similar to the way Elena works to identify opportunities and partnerships, we have that at the county level. Big dollars flow through the county, and there's a lot at the county level. And so there's the opportunity there to make a difference. In terms of spending, as Chris has correctly noted, this is thus far, it's not a great budget, but it's a sort of an okay budget for the time we're in. So I think we're on pins and needles, hoping things go through. What we would look at, Jan, and again, I'm speaking now for CCF and not for others, is we are interested in how those funds affect our partners,
right,
and the issues that we have focused on. So in our case, for example, within health, we focused on the Medi-Cal expansion, and we focus a lot on behavioral health. So we're not focused on everything. We're focused on those areas with perhaps additional attention to areas that might get cuts, where we can sort of do gap filling. We're not interested. We're not sort of good at jumping into a new area, but rather identifying others who might be to support those. So
thanks so much. I know we have a lot more questions for you, but I want to make sure we hear as much as possible from Elena. Elena, you're our cleanup hitter in this baseball game, right? And you're our last speaker here. So, what is the governor's office, and how are you kind of approaching your job and engaging nonprofits and looking forward to this next legislative session?
Well, thank you so much, Jan, and great to be here and on this esteemed panel with all my colleagues. I've been in this role about 6 months. So my role is senior advisor for social innovation for the governor. So what that really means is working on public-private partnerships, working closely with philanthropy to identify despite all the things that we are doing at the state and with this large budget, there are always going to be gaps, and there are always going to be areas where we simply can't function without the partnership of philanthropy and, of course, the nonprofit sector. And so my role is really trying to identify where those gaps might be, where philanthropy, informed by all of you, are pushing on certain priorities. And I think for me, staying true to what we're hearing from communities themselves, and instead of our kind of various ivory towers, is really important. And so I really welcome this discussion and just being part of it. This role started when Governor Newsom assumed office, so I'm the second one to have this role. And really, it just demonstrates like we can't do it alone. It's, I think, embraces a certain level of humility to say, there are gaps. And I think obviously a nod to that in the budget when we're talking about the contracting process for nonprofits, just how incredibly difficult that is, and a recognition that we can and must do better. And so it does take sometimes those hard and messy conversations, but often really kind of brilliant and transformative conversations to help identify where we can fill those gaps in. I just wanted to say a few things that are really important in terms of the partnerships and how we approach them in the governor's office. One is just investing in relationships. So, being here today, talking to other foundations and community organizations and taking the time to really understand and learn what's going on is super important. I think also acknowledging the various roles that we sit in. So I kind of grew up in the nonprofit sector, spent a lot of time in philanthropy, and now and funded a lot of policy and advocacy. So appreciated your comments, Jarrett, and I think that's critically important. And so from where I sit today in the governor's office, working on public-private partnerships, I think understanding all of the roles and where we sit and where we can leverage impact ultimately, to better the lives of Californians, that's always going to be a lens. I think it's really important also to communicate impact, like what we're doing. So one thing I've noted just 6 months into working at the state is there's a lot of words around budgets and contracts and RFPs. And I think one thing that and those are all critically important. One thing that's really important to me as well is looking at the humanity of all of these things that we're doing. So we're talking about really big problems, really big budget allocations. What does that actually mean for real Californians on the ground? And I think, the priorities change. We saw so much tragedy over the last 24 hours, right? And I think also over the last few weeks, so much tragedy with the storms, earthquakes, and often it's the most vulnerable communities that are left behind. And sadly, as I said in a webinar we did last week with Philanthropy California on storms and kind of philanthropic support, it's the folks I think that are most in need who don't get the kind of media attention, for example, or aren't like front and center at the top of people's minds. And so I'll talk about a partnership in a second that helps kind of lift that up. All of those things with an equity lens. So I just want to quickly give you a few examples, because I think sometimes we talk about partnerships and it's very vague and lofty. So maybe I'll just quickly walk through a few examples of how that's looked. The Guaranteed Income Fund is one example. So as you probably all know, there were $35 million allocated towards guaranteed income pilots in the state, particularly with a focus on foster youth and pregnant individuals. And it required a 50% philanthropic match. And a big part of that is to help ensure that the direct cash payments don't count as income. So if you have some private dollars along with public dollars, that helps meet that need. So we very strongly felt like that philanthropic match is very challenging in communities where there aren't strong philanthropic players, and that presents an equity issue. And so we partnered with the Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, Asset Funders Network, Economic Security Project, and social finance on a fund that is specifically targeted towards meeting that kind of making sure that there's geographic equity, that those folks who are awarded grants for these pilots are able to secure the philanthropic matching requirement, even if they live in a rural area without a lot of philanthropic support. The second one I want to just note is actually in partnership with one of the conveners here, the League of California Community Foundations. Just with all of the work, the storms and the work happening, we all know community foundations are often kind of at the ground level. They're the first responders. They're the ones with the closest ties to community. I know this, having worked in a community foundation, those relationships are incredibly important. And so the state, the Office of Emergency Services, we're very proud to partner with the League of California Community Foundations and Philanthropy California to drive more resources towards the Disaster Relief, Recovery, and Resilience Fund. The League has also been a very important partner just in getting local resources to those local organizations first, the local community foundations. So after the earthquake, for example, I sent out a note to the community that if anyone wants to be part of the lists that the emails that I send out, it's not too often, I promise, but just sending out a note to say Humboldt County is suffering. Humboldt County needs help now. And it's a place where there are many tribal communities. When you think about like who's pummeled by not just the earthquake and the storms on top of it. The Humboldt Area Community Foundation, Wild Rivers Community Foundation needed help immediately. And I was just so blown away by the response. So all of this is like within what the state is doing broadly and to help find those gaps and fill them in. So my I think ask today is like, absolutely, there are, this is, I think my colleague said it best, like this is not an ideal budget year. It's also not the worst situation that we could anticipate, but there are going to continue to be gaps. And I recognize that you all as nonprofits are kind of the lifeblood of so much of what's happening in the state and how services are delivered. And so in my role, would just ask that we continue to keep that dialogue open. I talk to foundations all the time. It is my core job to say, you know, these are the gaps that we're seeing at the state level. How can we partner with philanthropy to help address some of those needs, and also hear from philanthropy what's top of mind as we continue with our priorities within the state. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I know we probably have some Q&A, and Jan, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, Elena, I know a lot of nonprofits on one hand are really happy to see the state partnering with our foundation community, but there's also some concerns about it too. I think, you know, it's also a sense of like, is what the state is raising money from foundations. It's competing with nonprofits who are also asking for money from foundations, and kind of also worried, frankly, that in the future that the state government will start to rely on foundation dollars when really foundations should be doing work that government isn't well equipped to do. So how do you think about the future of these kind of continued funding of state initiatives by the foundation community?
That's a really great question. And I think the short answer is, you know, of course, state dollars are eclipse smaller dollars. But my whole perspective here is that it's often those smaller dollars that often make or break the success of a state program. So, for example, you know, and this is related to the contracting issue, there's a lot of interest right now, and I think as it should be, in supporting the capacity building of local grassroots organizations to access state funding. You know, we also, on the flip side, need to be focused on improving the contracting process itself. However, in this reality, it is a gap. It is complicated, and it's going to take time and advocacy to right that ship. And so in the meantime, there are gaps that the state just can't fill. At the end of the day, even though the dollars are big, they are limited. And also, as you all know all too well, it takes time. You know, there's a process, or it's a complex state, it's a big state, and it is often the kind of smaller private dollars that are able to help jumpstart things, innovate, and get on the ground like they did in Humboldt County for immediate relief.
Thanks. Okay, we have a couple of questions for everybody, but Elena, one specific question: how do we get on your mailing list?
I'll put my email in the chat, and you all can feel free to send me a note.
Jan, would it be okay just to sort of partially try to answer the question you just asked, Elena? I'm
Please.
sort of the other side of that, right? And I will only speak to my own experience. I don't know, Elena may have she might do a lot of arm twisting with other people, but the way I have experienced it, Elena, working with Elena and her predecessor, is more of like kind of an attempt to, I don't know if herding cats is the right metaphor, but there is, for example, Project Room Key was a big initiative, and there was an effort, this wasn't you, Elena, this was your predecessor, to, in addition, so it wasn't instead of, it wasn't offsetting of, but rather it was in addition to the commitments of the state, there was an effort to build out, this was again during COVID, right, to get even more units for of transitional housing commitments through Project Room Key. And we did that by a lot of convening and pushing foundations to do more, at least those foundations that were engaged in that space. So it was a way of focusing effort, not displacing revenues from one source to the other. The money still ended up with our community development corporations who were in that space of doing transitional housing with the wraparound services. But it was sort of using the bully pulpit of the governor through Elena or her predecessor that really was attempting to leverage more dollars. Now, I think, Jan, it's a fair question to say, well, those dollars might have gone to education or they might have gone to another area. And that's a fair point. But it's more of this bully pulpit. The dollars aren't actually, at least in my experience, we weren't writing a check to the governor's office. We were just committing our dollars to a certain issue that was being focused on.
Thanks.
And
Go ahead.
sorry, just really quick. Thank you, Jarrett. And I wanted to, one thing I've also noted is that the dollars are important, but they're just one tool in the toolbox. There is so much more that we can do in terms of partnering with philanthropy and partnering with nonprofits on kind of rowing in the same direction towards our shared priorities and goals. So funds are one big way to kind of power that and make that happen, but there's so many other tools as well.
Thanks. So speaking of kind of the use of funds, that's a question here I think a lot of people might have on their minds. Given how much reserves we're talking about having, why isn't the government using those to buttress some of the critical services or to not push back some of the things that Chris had talked about pushing back? Chris, in particular, do you have a comment on the reserves issue?
Yeah, I think the governor's being careful at this point. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's happening with the economy. And as I said in my remarks, I think they're expecting an actual larger shortfall by the time they get to the May revision. And so I think they're just holding some of the tools in abeyance for a bit, and they may come to using some of those. I know that folks in legislative leadership are already talking about using a portion of the reserves and pushing back at the administration about that. So I think there will be a debate about it. I think one of the things to know is that the main reserve, so out of the $37 billion that there are sitting in reserves, the main reserve, which is in the low 20 billion mark, in order to use that, because it's constitutionally protected, the governor and the legislature have to declare a fiscal emergency, which you can clearly do if there's a budget shortfall. And then they're allowed to use half of it in the first year of that emergency. So there are also some limitations on how much of the funds they can use in a given year.
Right. Other comments on the reserves? Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to comment that in addition to the trigger sort of mechanism, that's also kind of a, let's wait and see approach before deciding to dip into those. The governor also, for those of us that do natural resource or environment and climate work, a significant percentage of the proposed kind of pullbacks came in that space, but it was coupled with an important announcement that the governor made that while he has not previously supported a natural resources bond being kind of crafted by the legislature and going before voters, he explicitly said during his budget announcement that he is open to a resources bond. And so for those of us in that space, what we're seeing potentially is I'm pulling back these general fund dollars that we had previously allocated, and an idea the governor may be entertaining that a resources bond would come forward to more than sort of offset that those kinds of cuts for similar types of investments, with the asterisk that that's in the future and contingent on the legislature and voters approving it. But I just wanted to flag that as another way the governor, I think, kind of refrained from dipping in to reserves at this moment in time and is looking at other ideas.
Thanks. So I think, one of the questions we're seeing in the chat and the Q&A box, Elena, sorry to put you on the spot again, but, you've expressed, a desire to hear from people on the ground, nonprofits on the ground and community foundations on the ground. So what's the best way to reach out to you to figure out if there's a partnership that might be available or possible?
Yes, and just acknowledge that question. There will never be enough, and that's why I think we have to be strategic and prioritize, and that's where it goes beyond the dollars. Please email me. I've been talking to community foundations and other foundations across the state. I've been visiting. I can only learn by being there and talking to you. So I've learned a lot from those conversations, and will continue to do that.
Thanks so much. We're going to end in just maybe another 5 minutes or so. So I just want to invite each one of the panelists to just reflect a little bit on what you've heard today and kind of what's a message for nonprofits, okay, and for community foundations and for foundations, right? It's like, give us some marching orders or at least some marching suggestions, all right, given all of your perspectives. And let's go in kind of reverse order. We start with you, Elena, and then finish with you, Chris.
That's a great question. I think for me, I would say, please know that there is a deep respect and awareness from the governor's office for the work that all of you do every day. And so that one line on page 110 is important. And I think as Jennifer said, there are folks who have been identified within the administration to help work on that. And also appreciate your patience, and continued partnership, knowing that there's a lot to be done on both ends. And, I would say equity is the kind of key focus. We can leverage these public-private partnerships with an equity lens. That's where like the magic happens, right? And so I am really eager and open to have those conversations and to continuing to partner with you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Elena. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jarrett. How about you?
The budget, such an interesting conversation. And Chris, I applaud you for how you talked about the reserves. This is an argument, Jen, where we are actually having an argument with our future selves, right? Like if we raid all the reserves today, it's great for this year, but those of us who are leading that nonprofit in 2 or 3 or 4 years, if it continues to be a bad budget, we'll have wished maybe we kept some of those reserves in to offset future kind of revenue shortfalls. And so it's an interesting thing that requires of us kind of maintaining in the background. And to some extent for philanthropy, we think about, kind of we watch and maybe consider backfilling or how we can either make up for or in some case opportunistically perhaps jump in with funding to advance those systems change priorities, because there are opportunities in this as well, as I mentioned earlier with our broadband example. It's a very interesting time. Hopefully it won't be a hard time for all of us, and this will just be a blip in the road.
Thanks, Jordan. I wanted to give a special thanks to you for bringing Justin Bieber into this conversation. That doesn't happen that often. And
Kim Kardashian, I got them both in. Did you notice?
That, but I thought that was just icing on the cake. I mean, okay, but thank you. Jennifer, what are your sort of thoughts about what we should all in our various roles be doing right now?
Sure. Well, first I'll dovetail on what something Jarrett just said. I'm grateful that there are members of the legislature, despite all of the personnel change, that there are members who were here the last time California confronted the need to make serious cuts, and many of them reflect on, they regret some of the decisions to make deeper cuts than were necessary and saw the adverse fruits, the challenges that posed. So I am grateful that they will be in the discussion that will take place over the next 6 months to make sure that the state tries to land in the best possible space in that tension between, as Jarrett, you described, that our future selves and our current selves, making sure that we're making thoughtful reductions that don't make holes and problems and suffering kind of larger in the future. So I'm grateful for that. I guess what I would say is selfish as the person with Jan leading the charge on the nonprofit sector side. We're going to be making a lot of appeals to our nonprofit colleagues for information that helps us answer questions that come up in the conversation with the administration and the legislature. And while it is nerdy and wonky and doesn't feel like it's in anyone's specific mission to try to adjust these contracting terms, they do meaningfully relate to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve together. And they certainly relate to the lives that we are all trying to live and practice of self-care. And part of that is fixing some of these really challenging situations that make nonprofit work kind of hard for the actual people that we are all trying to do that work. So when you see those requests, and we will try to manage them, please respond and please be open and candid so that we can help try to drive the best possible conversation and outcome on that.
Thanks. Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I said at the end of my remarks earlier that we sort of have to be prepared both to make our asks, try to get as much as we can when we can, but also be ready to protect against cuts. I guess the one addendum I'd put on that is that we also need to hold our state leaders accountable, that they don't leave tools in the toolbox that can actually help us avoid cuts. So using a portion of reserves, because the reason you have rainy day funds is to use them when it's raining, and budget shortfalls mean it's raining. Using revenue options, looking at things like loopholes in the tax system. The state is much better positioned for a downturn this time around because of a series of other budget maneuvers that have been made over the years that are very technical and wonky, and I won't go into here, but making sure that they use all of the tools there and it doesn't become a conversation where they're trying to get you to help them figure out how to mitigate the pain of cuts, I think is one of the key messages I would say as we look to the next few months.
I guess I could sum all of you are saying, get involved, get active, respond to emails, about calls for action, ask for stuff, ask legislators, ask foundations, ask donors, ask government, and ask one another, I think, to be as much help as we can be. So I wanted to give some thanks to our off-camera team today. In particular, I think we've had a lot of help from Emily at Southern California Grantmakers and Carla at Philanthropy California, putting in helpful links in the chat. And a reminder that all of the information, including all the links and comments in the chat and Q&A, will be sent to you in a couple of days. And our behind the camera staff at CalNonprofits, Lauren Kay, our communications director, and our two tech staff for today, Lynn Yo and Vanessa Cruz. So thanks to everybody and to this partnership for putting this together. And I want to thank all of our panelists who are all so succinct, so on point, so direct. And you all could have been having a second latte or something like that. And instead you took the time just to give all this information to all of our participants, to our more than 100 participants today. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.